Welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cohn. I'm the founder and CEO of Amity Advisory, and I'm happy to serve as host for the Inside Legal ESG podcast series. Today, we are very excited to have with us Sean West. Sean is the co-founder of Hence Technologies, an award-winning legal technology company, and he's also author of the GeoLegal Notes newsletter, where he draws on decades in the political risk industry to advise legal leaders on risks and opportunities driven by geopolitics. Welcome, Sean.
It's great to be here, Pam. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with your background, because I think it's an interesting journey that you have been on that got you to the intersection of legal and geopolitics. Let's start there.
So it's not a linear path to become deeply interested in both legal and geopolitics. There are many lawyers who end up intersecting with the political sector along the course of their journey. There are political scientists who end up studying, how laws are made, right? That's a core function of political science, and as a result, they have to do a decent amount of legal analysis to be good at their jobs. But really, for me, I came at this from deep experience on both sides of this. So I spent about over a decade at a company called Eurasia Group, which is really the market leader for geopolitical advice. I was the deputy CEO there. And earlier in my career, I was an analyst forecasting US politics at that same company. I've now spent almost half a decade as co-founder at Hence, digging into the legal sector, and what I was in order to craft software that solves a number of the problems generally that in-house counsel face, but also their applications to the environment for law firms. And one of the things I was most struck about was I would go to legal conferences that were talking about big issues of the day, but it was only lawyers talking to lawyers about these issues, and that there really wasn't a lot of outside perspective coming in. So you could have a conversation on something like, how will the use of AI in the legal sector be regulated, but have no analysis from someone who actually understands the politics around professional services, or the broader politics around taxation, or the broader politics around the regulation of AI more generally. So, I sort of stepped back and thought, well, if I'm going to these conferences and feeling like all of the conversations are lawyers talking to lawyers about lawyering, other people must be feeling like there's a need for external perspective. I think on the flip side, I was going to lots of public policy summits and conferences and finding that the legal perspective was almost bifurcated out of it. It was almost split off. There was no avenue to talk about issues like access to justice, or things that really fundamentally are public policy issues that matter to policymakers. They're just not being talked about because it's almost like the lawyers will address that somewhere else. And so I thought there should be a bridge between the two of these topics. And so I really took it upon myself to both start speaking on this and also writing the newsletter that you referenced, that really asked this question about how do global affairs impact the practice of law, and what do legal leaders need to know?
So building on that, where you said the lawyers are speaking to lawyers, and then you go to other conferences and the lawyers aren't there, or are operating in a different realm, you recently wrote that only 1% of the attendees at Davos, the World Economic Forum event a couple of weeks ago, only 1% were general counsel. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a pretty striking statistic when you realize that, as much as Davos is kind of a fading star, it still is the lodestar for a lot of conversations about the future of the global economy, the future of public policy, the future of sustainability. I mean, a lot of major conversations happen there. I think there are a couple of things that are at fault for this. Number one, I think that the perception that Davos is a place to make deals probably leads to an overemphasis on the executive leaders who are there to network with government officials and with with other clients in order to get business done, rather than the substance of Davos, which is not really how Davos is positioned, right? It's there are substantive outputs from it. But I think second, there's probably it tells us something about the way chief legal officers and general counsels are perceived within their larger corporations in general, which is to say that as much as the GCs now have risk and sustainability and corporate affairs and government affairs reporting into them, they're still not instinctively thought of as a representative of the organization for conversations like this. I think that's a total misperception. I think the GC is sitting in perhaps one of the most powerful seats to impact policy and the positioning of the company. And I think part of this is about the more legal background GCs, right? Because there are plenty of GCs that came out of government, came out of presidential administrations or whatnot. They're more political GCs, but the more kind of legal background GCs who are being asked for these questions to take on more of a confident role, raise their hand and want to be at the forefront of those discussions. And I think when you think about how the core topic at Davos this year was the regulation of AI, and so much of that is going to be in the hands of the interpretation of lawyers of new legislation, new policies that are being drafted, what's permissible for their companies, right? There was a lot that could have been added from that perspective that's just missing.
So one of the reasons I reached out to you a number of weeks ago is because something called the 2024 GeoLegal Outlook landed in my inbox. And I, after reading it, shared it with a number of my colleagues and friends saying, this is exactly the way I think. You are spot on when it comes to the role lawyers should play. So I would love to talk a little bit about some of the 5 items that you listed in the 2024 GeoLegal Outlook. And I'm going to name all 5 of them first for our listeners, and then we'll go to however many we have time for. Number 1 is the rule of law recession. Number 2, 2024 political stew. Number 3, war to the second power. Number 4, and this goes to your point you just made, lawyers in the lead on AI. And number 5, guilt by representation. Very provocative topics. Let's start with number 1, the rule of law recession. I think I know what those words mean, but explain to it for our listeners.
Yeah, it's a great phrase which I reference the World Justice Project for. And what I wanted to highlight in my in my theme of rule of law recession is that we're actually seeing a real decay in the power of law at both global and national levels. So at an international and global level, we're seeing a total reduction in the ability to depend on international law for outcomes that have been established either in statute or customarily, right? International law often is non-binding, but there's plenty of custom that guides the way of behavior. We saw, the almost complete eradication of the WTO adjudication process in recent years. We see the WTO no longer as an engine for tariff reduction, in part because of some of this. We've seen, you only have to turn on your TV and look at the wars that are ongoing around the world to wonder what, if any, power the Geneva Conventions have on guiding rules of engagement. And we've seen countries like the UK leave the EU and prove that that signing up to supranational legal structures is not a one-way street. And as a result, I step back and I say, okay, at the international level, countries are retreating, and they're really looking after their own. But what about at the national level? And that's where the World Justice Project's analysis comes in, where they've highlighted for a number of years in a row that there's been a decline in rule of law in more than half the countries that they assess. And they assess pretty much every country around the world. And what that means is that citizens are either less able to avail themselves of the legal system to get fair outcomes, or they're not getting fair outcomes from the legal system. at increasing rates. And I think it's easy sitting in a Western country to sort of believe that the legal system generally functions well for people who have money to be able to to have representation. The legal system and generally doesn't function well for people that don't. But the sanctity of law isn't questioned. When in reality, I think the risk here is that the sanctity of law is. And we'll get into elections in a minute, but the 2024 presidential election in the US is the most likely election we've ever had to end up being resolved in the courts. And half the country, just almost by definition of how divided the country is, will feel that whatever the high court decides in a situation like that is invalid. And we got a taste of this in 2020 with the legal strategies the Trump administration ran to try to overturn the election or prevent the certification of the election. And I think we have a lot more of that in store. And I think that sort of erodes the overriding power of law. And that's the backdrop against which lawyers are practicing this year. And so the reason that I highlight this as a theme is not just to say, oh, isn't that interesting? Shouldn't we track it? But this is the backdrop against which everyone is practicing. And if that's true, then lawyers are either practicing in unjust systems and have some reputational risk for perpetuating injustice, or they have a moral obligation to stand up and call it such when they see that in the system. Yet there's a lot of reputational risk that comes from that. So I think there's a lot of obligation on the legal profession to take stock of where we are and stand up and have a point of view, even at your own risk. And I think a corollary to that is just on the access to justice side, which is, we see a lot of funding. We see access for justice funding declining, legal aid funding declining on a real basis in the US pretty considerably. Technology has the ability to change a lot of this, but we need actors and stakeholders to stand up and say that they want technology to be able to be applied in this context to remedy some of these challenges.
So you mentioned the reputational risk. So I'm going to jump to number 5 because lawyers do have a role to play in this. And of course, often I hear from lawyers, everybody deserves representation. But one wise lawyer said to me that defending the wrongly accused is a lot different than helping my client do damage in the world. So what role should lawyers play in working with their clients to solve some of these societal challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question. The theme number 5, guilt by representation, really what I was trying to get at here is the fact that lawyers choose their clients. They choose who they work with in private practice. And well, one can argue that even people on trial for heinous criminal acts deserve representation. I think it's not to say that the reputation of the person that frees them needs to stay the same as it was before they took that case on. I think the corollary in the business space is even stronger, which is to say that for sure, if you have a government proceeding against you for anti-money laundering or sorry, for money laundering or for fraud or for some sort of commercial crime, someone should represent you. But if the business of your legal practice is to enable people to commit money laundering or commit fraud, then I think increasingly we should expect that those lawyers be held to account. And I think we can go further on that, which is to say that lawyers representing individuals who've been sanctioned because they're involved in, let's say the Russian military action, the war in Ukraine, right? There were a whole bunch of Russians that were sanctioned. But like a law firm can choose to represent the people who are sanctioned or not represent the people who are sanctioned. That's a choice. I think similarly, as much as law firms go through pains to try and show that they have, decent environmental practices, right? I mean, all their emails remind me not to print them as if I print email anymore. The reality is if they, if you're gonna go out and talk about how wonderful you are at protecting the environment, but you're actually setting legal precedent by defending polluting companies and defending their rights to pollute, then don't expect that your more green clients aren't gonna hold you to account for that. And I think, I highlight this because it's often thought of as like a safe zone that law firms can kind of represent whoever they want. But the reality is, just like, management consulting firms advising companies to lay off all of their staff, or, if a memo leaks of a management consulting firm saying to take benefits away from a particular class, like, they're held to account for their advice and for the role that they play. I think law firms in general run the same risk. And the reason I highlighted it for 2024, this is not new, but for 2024, everything's a political hot potato. So if the law firms that were involved in initially reviewing the 2020 election got a whole bunch of negative press around them as a result of it. And in-house leaders will tell us that didn't like that, will tell us they don't forget who those firms were. And I think this year, particularly as lawyers, right, most members of Congress, or, well, I don't have the hard stat in front of me, but my perception is that most members of the US legislature were lawyers. Like, that's the at least the plurality profession. You know, it implies to me that lawyers are going to be called upon to become advisors and join the campaigns as the campaigns heat up, and that'll bring risk for their firms and for their prior firms if they've left the firms to do that as well.
So since you touched on it, we're going to go there next. One of the items on your list is the 2024 political stew. And you've just hinted at that in the last answer. So let's go there.
Sure. Well, what I'm trying to do with GeoLegal Notes is not take a US centric view. I think the US, the US elections this year, it's obviously meaningful for anyone who has a significant business in the US. It's meaningful in terms of the vectors by which it will impact international business. But it's one of almost, 70 elections in 2024, which is more elections than any of us have seen in our professional careers. So, there's like less than 200, roughly 200 countries recognized in the world. So 70 of them have elections this year. And what's really important when you realize that is for global businesses and global law firms that have clients everywhere, there's both risks and opportunities that come from these election cycles. The policy change has the potential to be a boost for businesses that are able to take advantage of it. It has the ability to be a major disruptor for businesses that are caught off guard. So understanding that that passively waiting until the election results are in to develop your strategy for yourself, for your clients, is not a way to success. I think is really, really important. Thinking, what if we see a lean to the right or the left in this country? Is this better or worse for my business? What if I have to exit this country because a nationalist leader comes to power that is anti-American business or British business or wherever you're based, and I have to exit? What's my strategy to get out of it, to get out of this country? What if the risk of, and I'm sure we'll get to this with my third theme on war, but like, what if the risk of war increases because of the election of a particular candidate? Am I comfortable that my operational risk is increased as a result of that? How did my insurance policy shift as a result of political change? Like, so much of this stuff can be planned in advance and is much harder to do on your back heels. And so, big response to this is to really build resilience in the enterprise to be successful in any type of outcome. But part of that is, involves having to think in advance about it. And what I think is most important critically to stress is that most large corporations and most large law firms do not have the ability to monitor 70 elections, nor should they. They need to find channels to draw on different expertise to help them do that. So my advice isn't that they should hire huge teams to monitor all of this. It's make sure that they're able to get the intellectual inputs they need. and the advice that they need to take action.
And so you talked about, it's much easier to plan in advance for some of these options than to be on your back heels. And when I think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I mean, we could see that coming, right? It was sort of a slow march. We all thought what was going to happen. So in that case, yes, we probably could have planned. But when you think about the October events in Israel, I don't think many of us saw that as happening overnight. So talk to me a little bit about what you call war to the second power, and how can businesses even prepare for the breakout of war?
Yeah, it's an important framing of the question, which is to say what is foreseeable and what's not foreseeable. I think in the
Mhm.
in the Russian case, there were plenty of indicators that it was coming, and companies that got out early got much better deals than companies that are selling assets and fire sales right now in
Right.
Russia. And I think there's some interesting morals from that story that we can look at. I you know Obviously, the horrific attacks on Israel were not something that any of us foresaw, or that the Israeli government foresaw, or that U.S. intelligence foresaw. Um, but the reaction by Israel to the attacks was absolutely something
Mhm.
that was predictable and played out in slow motion on all of our television sets and continues. And the second order effects of that, for instance, the attacks on US ships in the Red Sea
Mhm.
and the military action that's going to follow behind that, the internationalization of this conflict, Iranian proxies, um, almost goading the US and the UK into broader regional conflict, was absolutely one of the biggest risks that happens when you see something like this. Now, if this were a political forecasting podcast, we talk about how would you think about what the next political activities are? But from a legal perspective, right, what is the reaction to steadfast US support
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
Israel in its military actions in Gaza today? Well, it's that US companies are facing reputational risk in a tougher operating environment throughout the Arab and Muslim world. We see lawsuits being filed in a number of countries about boycott movements against US companies. We see boycott movements rising up against products. Sort of reminds me of the backlash against Grey Poupon, which I think is actually made in New Jersey during the Iraq War, right? I mean, it's easy for people to want to be involved and take political action by choosing how they spend their money. And so thinking about your brand as a company and whether it lends itself to that type of reaction when you see an event like this, I think is critically important. I'll take it a step further. Many companies, not just in the US, have been unable to avoid taking a position on the conflict.
Right.
And that position necessarily alienates a part of their staff, regardless of what side it's on. And it alienates a part of their interview pool. And so the increase in employment lawsuits based on discrimination, for lack of promotion, lack of hire, unequal compensation, hostile work environment, as a result of that being perceived as being because of one's politics in this conflict, should be expected to increase too. Now, those are just a couple of examples, but the fact is that if we were to see actual kinetic, like military conflict in Asia, say over Taiwan in 2024, which is potential. I'm not saying it's likely, but the pro-independence candidate in Taiwan won again. There's a window in 2024 where China knows the US isn't going to want to get involved in an additional conflict in Asia when the president's running for re-election. It also knows that Donald Trump would have a more unpredictable response if it were to do it. It's a certain risk, and Taiwan is responsible single-handedly for keeping almost the entire global semiconductor industry afloat. Like, Taiwan is a critical input to most of the global semiconductor industry, which is a critical input to most of the products that we use in our lives. And so just kind of, it's not to say that it's the job of the legal department or of law firms to prepare for every eventuality. But the reality is that if a business is completely dependent on China in an environment where tensions between their home country and China are likely to increase, they better start planning for what an alternative would be. I think um, it's really never too early to do that type of planning, particularly when the indicators are there. Western countries are having a hard time in China right now. If US-China tensions increase further, they will have a much harder time. That is like in ways that are already playing out right now.
So given everything we've already talked about, I'm almost afraid to ask you this question. What gives you hope? Is there hope?
So I find a lot of hope in the potential for technology to increase increase access to justice, increase global wealth, increase interconnectedness again in ways that I think had been fraying, right? We had this sort of globalization order for the better part of 20 years, and that's fractured. But now we've got this almost international technology order that is at play. And that's not to say the large tech companies don't do anything wrong or that we should completely trust them or that that's like it's necessarily a good thing that the market cap of many of the large tech companies is bigger than many states. It's to say that I think to the extent that citizens measure their life, their quality of life in their ability to provide for their family and their ability to interface with their governments, I think we've got a pretty exciting path ahead of us. I've written a number of pieces. I wrote one for Bloomberg Law recently on why I think technological progress is going to change the practice of law in ways that enable the use of AI-powered software for self-representation and to increase access to justice for many that are currently disenfranchised. I feel particularly hopeful about that because I think we've seen deregulation of highly regulated sectors before, and I think the ability of people to form businesses, to get divorces, to defend themselves when there's a claim filed against them without having to go broke is really, really important. And look, we've lived through the first wave of it, which is basically tech-enabled form completion and things like that. But those form-based companies can't tell you if you've completed the form correctly or not. They can only tell you if if you've left something blank. They can't tell you if you're likely to have your permit rejected when you apply. They can't tell you any of that. It's not because the technology doesn't do it. I wrote a piece for Above the Law on legal robots in China that can predict you walk into a courtroom, you punch into a robot the claim you'd like to file, it'll predict whether you're likely to win and what the cost is going to be to you to file the claim. Like these are just data problems. The technology exists to solve a lot of this. It's the regulation that hasn't kept up. So I'm optimistic about that. I'm optimistic about the state of the economy right now. I think central banks are moving through their tightening cycle. And I think that's going to lead to them potentially keeping the wheels greased for economic growth, or in the event of some of these geopolitical shocks, I think we'll see the printing of money again that actually stabilizes some of it. Concerns about inflation aren't as high. Economic resilience is, particularly important. So I think the reason you might have saw me catch my words a few times. My outlook was a number of themes. They're not necessarily risks. And I think we can over-index on viewing everything through a risk lens. I think risk and preparedness are very different.
Yes.
One commentator said that there was a lot of meaningful stuff in my outlook, but that they thought it was a bit alarmist. And I sort of thought, there's nothing alarmist in helping people look around the corner and understand the way things could go. I'm not selling them legal services. I'm not telling them that they need to buy lots of stuff, right? I think it's very different when the person who can solve your problem is telling you that you have a major problem, right? But the reality is it's also good hygiene to understand what's going on in the world and prepare oneself for it. And there's a lot of things that are going right. As I said, it's just the political shocks have an ability to throw this year off. And I think particularly as we enter the beginning of the year with economic optimism, which was kind of the message coming out of Davos as an example, that's going to unlock investment, but that investment is going to be fragile because of the shocks that are in front of us.
So final question. When I have you back as a guest a year from now, not if, but when, what will we talk about? What will be on the horizon at that time?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot to discuss with respect to the future trajectory of ESG, which we didn't really get into in this conversation. There is a lot of nausea in the US right now, both in the ESG and anti-ESG community about how all the efforts that have been poured into ESG are going to play out, right? There's a movement to disrupt progress that's been made on this front, whether it's about increasing diversity or whether it's about increasing environmentally favorable practices, or increasing governance, because they're losers from those types of policies. But I think equally, there's a concern amongst even advocates that the pendulum swung too far in that being prioritized over profits in an environment where the economy is potentially fragile. And so, I think that battle is going to play out over the next year. And at the same time, other countries, particularly in Europe, are going to be steadfast in their support for these types of policies. And so the difficulty for businesses to navigate all these different requirements to operate in multiple places, I think is going to be something we're going to be discussing. So, to me, I'm an advocate for so many of the tenets that fall under the category of ESG. So I think I think it would be a real shame to see backsliding on this. And I'm disappointed when I see organizations taking the first exit ramp. I'm writing a piece right now about law firms who have changed their diversity scholarships to cover anybody who's demonstrated resilience. It's like, who's applying for a legal job that hasn't demonstrated resilience?
That's
right?
right.
And when you start seeing people do things that don't make sense, it's because it's political. And so I think there's a lot that we're going to be talking about in that front in a year from now.
I think you're absolutely right. I would love to give our listeners the opportunity to sign up for your newsletter. So where do they go to do that?
So you can go to GeoLegal, GeoLegal, geolegal.substack.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and you can get it. I hope you enjoy it. It comes out every week. Should be a fresh perspective on what's going on in the world, and hopefully it'll spark some debate.
Yep, it certainly landed well when I got my first issue a couple of weeks ago, and I'm very glad to now receive it regularly. Thank you so much for your willingness to have this conversation with us, Sean. It has been my pleasure, and I'm sure our listeners are thrilled with it as well. Thank you.
Well, it's a gift to present your audience, and thank you very much.